Hello, class! Today we will be discussing the Battle of Agincourt, a famous victory Henry V won over overwhelming French odds. Shakespeare played no small part in spreading its fame. I dare you to find a documentary that does not reference, let alone begin, with the St. Crispin Day speech. But there are a lot of myths and confusion surrounding the actual battle. The fabled English longbowmen were instrumental in the victory, but did they single-handedly defeat charging cavalry? What were Henry's motives? And did the French really commit war atrocities? Let's start with a little background. England had been at war with a divided France for decades in the 100 Years' War. England itself was just getting over its own internal squabbles after Henry's father had deposed the previous king. Partly to unite his own country, and partly to regain ancestral lands, Henry launched an invasion into France. He landed at the port of Harfleur, and despite Shakespeare's version of events, the siege did not go well.
Henry's men tapped into the clams and the mussels and the oysters that grew in profusion in the waters around Harfleur. The trouble was that the oyster beds were right next to the town's sewage outlet, and large numbers of the men started to go down with dysentery. 2,000 men died, and another 2,000 had to be sent back to England. Cheers.
Discipline was strict in Henry's camp after the siege. Normally, looting was a common practice among all armies of the time. In fact, it was one of the main reasons why soldiers went off to war.
William Thornton's haul at Harfleur, a woolen blanket, a full belly, and a silver crucifix.
Sources conflict on whether Henry really did execute soldiers for looting Harfleur, but if he did, it would be because he considered the town his property already, and looting it would be stealing directly from his own coffers. However, Henry also threatened the governor in order to get the town in Shakespeare's version. In actuality, Henry did not have an easy time capturing Harfleur, despite what threats he may have levied at the governor. Hoping for a quick conquest, instead it took Henry nearly 8 weeks to sack the town, and possibly cost him a third of his fighting men. The losses at Harfleur and the subsequent dysentery afflicting his troops are the main reason Henry's army was made up mostly of archers in the later battle at Agincourt. Moreover, while he was entrenched in the siege, the French had time to raise an army to fight him off. The siege ate away at the time he could campaign, and rather than winter in enemy lands, he made for another port, Calais. Along the way, Agincourt ensued. And as a small aside, the French knights captured at Harfleur were paroled to go collect their ransom. They gave their word to return with money to buy their freedom, were let go, and then returned with the money. Let's talk about these knights, as just about any medieval battle has to include them. They were the cream of the crop military troops, noblemen who were bred to fight and were rich enough to carry the state-of-the-art weaponry and armor. Knights were the tanks of their time, and reached the peak of their superiority in the Middle Ages. Mounted warriors have been in existence throughout all of recorded history. The first battle we have records of, war chariots were pulled by horses. But it wasn't until the inventions of the stirrup and pommel that really transformed the mounted man into a formidable foe. With the technological advancements, a horse charge could plow through ranks of men without fear of being unseated from impact. The force would transfer to the horse, rather than throwing the man. It is no exaggeration for the Dauphin to have complimented his horse so much, as it was not only his shiny hot rod, or an extension of his warrior prowess, but likely a battle-hardened companion who saved his life on more than one occasion. The horse was a trained warrior in and of itself, and would kick with lethal power or even bite to deadly effect. Over the centuries, knights built upon their technology to become fully ensconced in their armor. This made them all but impenetrable on the battlefield. Traditionally, standard foot soldiers or archers had little chance of defeating one, and when the fighting eventually became hand-to-hand combat, the English fought in units to bring down a knight and would surround him and either dispatch him or take him as a prisoner. It is a common myth that knights sacrificed mobility for their defense. They were almost fully mobile in their range of motion, and even developed martial arts that resemble modern judo, complete with throws. At Agincourt, the English warbows had few vulnerabilities to aim for, but were skilled enough and launched enough volleys that the French feared arrows penetrating their bassinets' eye holes. The other vulnerability was the horse itself, whose armor tended to be just on the head. The arrow might not kill the horse outright, but it would certainly disrupt its charge and potentially panic it into its own friendly troops, causing chaos and a breakdown in vital formations. So who were these archers? For the most part, they were common soldiers who were skilled enough to rate a higher level of pay than their foot soldier counterparts. Knights were clearly the wealthier troop, but archers weren't cheap, especially in the numbers Henry amassed. Many of them were actually murderers and thieves, conscripted as a means to commute their sentences. Supposedly these men had to fire 8 arrows a minute to qualify for the ranks, but it is disputed that their actual rate of fire was that high in battle. The English warbow, or longbow, was designed for high impact, and while they could loose many volleys in a short time, drawing the bow back to its full potential required time and strength. A little propaganda may have lent some needed strength to the English longbowmen. A rumor spread through the camp that the French promised to chop off the first 2 fingers of any archer they captured, ensuring they would never fire a bow again. This was probably unlikely, as the longbowmen were not valued high enough for capture, and there were rules in place regarding the treatment of prisoners, much like our current Geneva Conventions. Still, the English had this encouragement to ready themselves for battle, while the French had their own morale issues working against them. Remember how Sir Blount pretended to be King Henry IV at the Battle of Shrewsbury? This was a common practice at the time, to protect the king, but Henry V made sure he alone stood out by wearing a crown on top of his helmet. Meanwhile, the King of France was not at the battle. He was a little insane and believed he was made of glass, which means he wanted to be as far away from things that could shatter him, like in the middle of a war. Instead, the French had a council of war, which ended up having disastrous effects. One of their top military strategists came up with a plan to neutralize the English archers, but that was shot down by other noblemen in favor of a more honorable strategy. The French nobility wanted to square off in glorious man-to-man combat so the names of the victorious would live on in history. Instead, we have records of the nobility who showed up and did not go home. Remember, though, they thought that they were going to have an easy victory. So what happened? Well, mud. Mud played an important role as any other factor. Typically, rain or water is bad for archers, as you need a dry bowstring to fire off arrows to any effect. The conditions looked terrible for the English on the eve of battle. Starving, sick, caught out under rain that would severely hamper their largest advantage. But when morning broke, the rain had let up, leaving a field full of mud. It is hard to imagine something so inconsequential seeming to have such an important role in history. But imagine trying to run through a field carrying 100 pounds, while arrows rock into you. Then add in the clinging effect of mud, bogging you down in your tracks. Now factor in people trying to kill you when you get to the other side. Not the best of scenarios. Also, Henry chose his ground well. The terrain looked like a flat plain, but actually sloped down drastically on the sides, which ended up funneling charging troops. He set his archers to both sides and had them hammer in long, sharpened stakes into the ground right behind them. His own knights and men-at-arms were placed in the center. The terrain pushed the attackers closer together towards the center, while the archers, and the greed of glory and wealth for besting an enemy knight, encouraged the attackers away from the sides. Henry led off with several volleys of arrows, provoking the battle-eager French to attack within just minutes. But in those minutes, thousands of arrows had already rained down. The cavalry charged first, through the thick mud, and the first line of foot soldiers followed behind. Just before they reached the English army, the archers stepped back behind the stakes. Instead of firing an arcing volley, they now leveled their bows and shot at close proximity. Injured men and horses led to a panic, and when the charging cavalry could not break through the line, they turned to retreat in poor order, crashing through the line of advancing foot soldiers. English infantry advanced to put down the stunned and injured soldiers floundering in the mud. They took prisoners where they could, and if they could not, used hammers and mallets to crush their victims, or stab them with swords or spears in their vulnerable armor joints. In disarray, the French sent in a second wave, but the tide of battle had turned against them, and that wave got swept up in the English momentum. The English captured thousands of French soldiers, but were still outnumbered. It was here that the war atrocities occurred. Shakespeare sort of glosses over it, but he does mention that Henry gives the order to kill all the prisoners. That is historically accurate. His men disobeyed him, mostly because the prisoners were worth money and ransom. Eventually, though, he brought down a squadron of archers to do the deed. Remember those guys who signed up to avoid their murder sentences? The archers did not have the clout to disobey the king, and they were outside the code of chivalry, so they began killing off French prisoners. If this sounds bad, it is. But it is not without reason. The rear of the English line was hit by looters, but it was thought to be an earnest attack at just the same time the third line of French soldiers were forming up. It looked to Henry that he would be surrounded, and he feared that the prisoners would break free and grab weapons from the battlefield. It is even possible there were actually more French prisoners than there were English soldiers. He may have had reasons to execute the prisoners, but remember that this was an age of chivalry, and knights and kings were expected to keep their word. It is unclear exactly how many men were executed, but close to a quarter of the French nobility lost their lives that day, and the ramifications of that rippled through their society for 100 years. The day belonged to Henry. Thanks in large part to this battle, he was able to sue for terms with the French. He married the French king's daughter and was named heir to the French throne. He was poised to realize the dream that brought England back to war, when he died of dysentery only weeks before the French king did, and never assumed the throne. Agincourt was an immensely important point in political, historical, and military terms, but it's curious that Shakespeare and history embellish certain aspects while downplaying others. This is a comment more on the contemporary situations of these portrayals, rather than actual historical events.
When Shakespeare wrote his famous play, Henry V, he did so at a time when English armies had again been fighting in France. And then during the Second World War, when Winston Churchill commissioned Laurence Olivier to make a film of Henry V, he did so again for the same reasons, to boost morale in advance of the Allied invasion of France.
It is sort of ironic, too, that often these portrayals uplift a nationalistic ideal, while the entire 100 Years' War set these nations' boundaries. But in Henry's time, France was not unified. While there was a king of France, there was also a Burgundy, Flanders, Normandy, Aquitaine, and Gascony, controlling enormous powers. English nobility owned more French land than the actual country of France. Henry's claim to the throne of France was based on his great-grandfather's claim. When Charles IV died, the closest male heir was his nephew, Edward III, but the French argued that his claim was invalid because it was passed from his mother, and a claim cannot pass through someone who did not possess the claim to begin with. As in, women could not stake a claim on the throne. Edward III was the grandfather of Henry IV, and the claim remained in contention for decades, but was settled through political maneuvering. When that broke down, for instance, when France aided their ally Scotland in their war against England, the claim was pressed again. Henry's solution was first political, the marriage to the daughter of the French king, rejoining the two dynasties in peace. But when that failed, he reignited a war. The politics and even the ancestry is extremely convoluted surrounding the 100 Years' War, but suffice it to say that France and England were very intertwined, and it was far from being as simple as an English versus French skirmish that Shakespeare portrayed. However, with that said, after all this research and trying to unravel the past, there was not a single point where Shakespeare got it wrong. This video set out to correct the popular myths, but Shakespeare was surprisingly accurate considering many of the details of the battle are still shrouded in mystery today. Harfleur was conceded eventually, and the siege was not pretty. Soldiers need not charge
once more unto the breach, dear friend! Once more!
Unless there is a job for soldiers to do. While there are certainly some instances of a little glossing over of events here or dramatizing a few factors there, the bulk of Henry V corresponds to our historical records of Agincourt. That doesn't necessarily mean things happened the way he said it did. Instead, it could evidence how much influence Shakespeare had in actually shaping how we view history. In either case, Henry V showcases some pretty powerful storytelling, and given all this, it should come as no surprise that we still study it today.